In the heart of the Roman Republic, while politicians competed for honor and generals thirsted for military glory, one man understood a truth his peers overlooked. The greatest fortunes are built not on what people desire, but on what they desperately need. His name was Marcus Licinius Crassus, and by the time his ambitions consumed him, he had accumulated wealth so vast that even Rome itself could not contain it. Yet the origins of that fortune lay not in distant conquests or inherited estates, but in something far more intimate and terrifying: the burning homes of his fellow citizens. Rome, in the 1st century before the Common Era, was a city perpetually on the verge of combustion. Its buildings rose higher with each generation, rickety apartment blocks called Insulae that climbed 5, 6, sometimes 7 stories into the smoky air. Constructed cheaply from timber and dried mud brick, heated by open braziers and lit by oil lamps, these structures housed hundreds of thousands of Romans in conditions that made fire not a possibility, but an inevitability. The narrow streets between buildings formed canyons where flames could leap from one structure to another in moments. The city had grown far beyond its ancient walls, sprawling across hills and valleys in a chaotic patchwork of residential districts, markets, temples, and workshops. In these densely packed neighborhoods, families lived stacked atop one another, separated by thin floors that creaked under footsteps and offered no barrier to spreading flames. There existed no organized fire response, no public water system adequate to combat large blazes, no trained force ready to mobilize when disaster struck. The Tiber River flowed through the city, and aqueducts brought fresh water from distant springs, but these systems were designed for drinking, bathing, and sanitation, not firefighting. When fire erupted in the upper floors of an insula, residents on lower levels might not realize the danger until smoke began seeping through floorboards or flames burst through walls. Families would rush into stairwells already choked with smoke, carrying children and elderly relatives, grabbing whatever valuables they could seize in their panic. Those who escaped into the streets would watch helplessly as everything they owned transformed into ash and ember, while those trapped inside faced deaths too terrible for historical sources to describe in detail. Crassus recognized this vulnerability with the calculating precision of a man who saw opportunities where others saw only chaos. Born into an old patrician family that had fallen on difficult times, he watched his father and brother die in the civil wars that tore Rome apart in his youth. The political violence of those years was not abstract or distant, but immediate and personal, playing out in Roman streets and Italian battlefields, dividing families and destroying fortunes. When the populist faction led by Gaius Marius seized control of Rome, they initiated proscriptions, official lists of enemies to be killed on sight, their properties confiscated, their families left destitute. Crassus's father appeared on these lists, marked for death because of his political allegiances. Crassus fled the city with a single slave and 3 friends, hiding in a cave on the Spanish coast where his family owned estates. For 8 months he remained concealed, supplied secretly by the estate's overseer, while Marius's forces hunted enemies of the state throughout the Roman world. When news finally reached him that Marius had died, and that Sulla, leader of the opposing faction, was marching on Rome with an army, Crassus emerged from hiding and made his way back to Italy. He raised a military force from his father's old estates and clients, demonstrating the kind of personal initiative that Roman politics rewarded, and joined Sulla's cause. Sulla's victory in the Civil War brought a new wave of proscriptions, this time targeting Marius's supporters and anyone else Sulla deemed an enemy of his new order. But where others saw only political violence and social upheaval, Crassus perceived opportunity. The proscriptions created instant markets in confiscated properties, estates and houses and businesses suddenly available for purchase at whatever prices their new circumstances dictated. Crassus purchased these properties aggressively, understanding that bloodshed and displacement created bargains unavailable in ordinary times. He acquired them not from the state, but from the proscribed men themselves, or rather from their widows, their relatives, their desperate agents seeking to salvage anything before execution or exile, eliminated all possibility of negotiation. Ancient historians would later criticize Crassus for profiting from the proscriptions, suggesting he even added names to the lists to target men whose properties he coveted. Whether these accusations reflect truth or political slander remains uncertain, but they reveal how Romans themselves understood the morally compromised origins of his fortune. Yet these early acquisitions, substantial though they were, represented only the beginning. The fortune that would eventually make Crassus the richest man in Rome required a more systematic approach, a repeatable method for converting others' misfortune into personal profit. Fire provided that method. Crassus assembled a private force of 500 slaves, purchasing men not for agricultural labor or domestic service, but for specialized training in firefighting and construction. This required significant initial investment. 500 slaves represented enormous capital outlay, and training them for specific technical skills added further expense. But Crassus understood that this force constituted infrastructure, a capital asset that would generate returns far exceeding its costs. He housed these slaves in barracks near his various properties, ensuring they could respond quickly when needed. He equipped them with tools and apparatus designed for firefighting, axes and hooks for pulling down burning structures, pumps and leather buckets for moving water, ladders and ropes for reaching upper floors, poles and chains for creating fire breaks. These men learned to assess burning buildings structurally, to identify which walls might collapse and which could be saved, to judge when demolition offered the only hope of containing spread. They practiced coordinated responses, developing signals and procedures that allowed hundreds of men to work together efficiently despite the chaos and danger of active fires. This knowledge, accumulated through experience and training, made them professionals in a city of amateurs, experts in a field where most Romans possessed only desperate improvisation. Crassus kept this force ready at all times, maintaining them at his expense even during periods when no fires required their services. This represented ongoing cost, but it ensured availability when opportunity arose. And opportunity arose frequently. Rome burned regularly, with fires erupting somewhere in the city almost weekly, and major conflagrations devastating entire neighborhoods several times each year. When smoke began rising from some crowded neighborhood, when shouts of alarm echoed through narrow streets and residents began fleeing their homes, word would reach Crassus quickly. His organization included lookouts and informants positioned throughout the city, slaves tasked with watching for signs of fire and reporting immediately to their master. When that moment arrived, Crassus himself would often rush to the scene, bringing not firefighting equipment, but the means to conduct business, scribes with writing materials, witnesses to validate transactions, pouches of coins for immediate payment. As flames devoured one building and threatened to spread to those adjoining, as residents fled with whatever possessions they could carry, and property owners watched their investments turn to ash, Crassus would approach with an offer. He would purchase the burning property immediately, on the spot, for whatever price he deemed appropriate, invariably a fraction of its value. He would also offer to buy the surrounding buildings, those not yet aflame, but clearly in danger. To owners of adjacent properties who could see flames approaching, who could feel heat through their walls and smell smoke seeping through cracks, who watched embers landing on their roofs, Crassus presented a simple calculation. Sell now for something, or lose everything within the hour. The genius of his system lay in the terrible simplicity of the choice he presented. A property owner could refuse Crassus's offer and hope that somehow the fire would be contained, that neighbors and passers-by would form effective bucket brigades, that divine fortune would shift the wind or bring sudden rain. They could hope that their building's construction would prove more resistant to flames than their neighbors, that fire breaks would hold, that the conflagration would exhaust itself before reaching their property. Or they could accept immediate payment, however meager, and salvage something from catastrophe. The offer might represent only a tenth of the property's normal value, perhaps even less, but it represented certainty. Coins in hand, a transaction completed, something preserved from total loss. Most chose the certainty of Crassus's coin over the likelihood of total loss. Faced with flames visible from their windows, heat blistering paint on their walls, smoke making breathing difficult, they signed away their properties for whatever Crassus offered. They made this choice not because they were foolish or weak, but because they were rational actors responding to impossible circumstances. Without any alternative source of professional firefighting assistance, without any reason to believe the fire could be stopped through their own efforts, without time to seek other buyers or negotiate better terms, they accepted Crassus's prices because refusing meant almost certain total loss. Only after the transaction was complete, only after the property legally belonged to him through documents witnessed and validated according to Roman law, would Crassus signal his slaves into action. Then, and only then, would the firefighting begin in earnest. His trained force would attack the flames with coordinated efficiency, deploying techniques and equipment unavailable to common Romans. They would form bucket brigades from the nearest water source, moving water with systematic efficiency rather than panicked disorder. They would demolish structures adjacent to the main fire, creating fire breaks that denied flames the ability to spread further. They would enter burning buildings to extinguish fires from within, accepting risks that untrained civilians could not safely assume. They would work through the night if necessary, their efforts illuminated by the very flames they fought, saving not their fellow citizens' homes, but their masters' newly acquired assets. If an owner refused his terms, Crassus would simply order his men to stand aside. His force would watch, idle and capable, as the flames consumed everything. They would intervene only if fire threatened properties Crassus already owned, creating fire breaks that protected his investments while leaving the stubborn owner's building to its fate. This was not firefighting as public service, but as private enterprise, not rescue, but transaction enforced by emergency. The presence of Crassus's organized force at the scene, visible to all, made the situation even more excruciating for those who refused his terms. Property owners would watch helplessly as trained firefighters capable of saving their buildings simply stood by on their master's orders. Professional assistance deliberately withheld until commercial terms were met. The aftermath of these fires proved as profitable as the emergency response itself. Crassus now owned dozens of properties throughout Rome's dense urban fabric, many damaged but structurally sound, others requiring complete reconstruction. He employed his slaves, now numbering in the hundreds beyond his firefighting force, to rebuild these structures. This vertical integration of his enterprise proved crucial to its profitability. He purchased materials in bulk, leveraging his massive buying power to obtain prices unavailable to smaller operators. He operated his own brick kilns in the countryside around Rome, producing the clay tiles and fired bricks that formed the bones of Roman construction. He maintained lumber operations that provided timber for beams and framing, quarries that supplied stone for foundations, workshops that produced the iron fittings and bronze fixtures buildings required. The Insulae that rose from the ashes bore his mark in more than just ownership. Crassus rebuilt them to maximize rental income, adding floors where possible, dividing spaces to create more individual units, employing construction techniques that prioritized economy over comfort. Roman building codes of that era were minimal to non-existent, allowing property owners tremendous freedom in how they constructed residential buildings. He became Rome's largest private landlord, owning entire neighborhoods that he had effectively purchased during their darkest hours. His properties sprawled across the city's most densely populated districts, housing tens of thousands of Romans whose monthly rents flowed steadily into his treasury. Roman law of that era contained no provision against such practices. There existed no concept of price gouging during emergencies, no legal protection for property owners negotiating under immediate threat, no public obligation for those with firefighting capacity to deploy it for common benefit. Crassus operated entirely within the boundaries of legality, exploiting gaps in civic infrastructure that the Republic had never addressed. The Senate, dominated by aristocrats who themselves owned extensive properties, had little interest in creating public fire services that might set precedents for other civic obligations. They preferred the traditional Roman approach: private initiative, family responsibility, neighborhood cooperation. That this system left Rome perpetually vulnerable to conflagration concerned them less than the possibility of increased public spending or expanded state authority. Crassus's fortune, built on these foundations, eventually exceeded that of any other private citizen in Rome. Ancient sources claimed he possessed wealth equivalent to the entire annual revenue of the Roman treasury. He owned silver mines in Spain, estates across Italy and beyond, urban properties throughout the Roman world. He employed thousands of slaves in enterprises ranging from manufacturing to education. He became Rome's premier private lender, offering credit to aristocrats and politicians who needed funds but lacked liquid assets, creating dependencies that bound Rome's political class to him through webs of debt and obligation. Most significantly, he funded the career of Julius Caesar when the younger man faced financial ruin, creating an alliance that would shape Rome's future. He used this wealth the way Roman elites always had, to purchase political influence, military command, and social prestige. He sought election to Rome's highest offices, serving as praetor and consul. He hosted feasts for tens of thousands of Romans, distributed grain to the poor, commissioned public works that bore his name. This was the Roman bargain. Private wealth converted into public benefaction, inequality justified through displays of generosity. That the wealth originated in others' desperation during fire emergencies went largely unremarked, or at least unremarked as unusual. Yet for all his riches, Crassus remained haunted by the one prize his money could not purchase: military glory comparable to that of Pompey and Caesar. This obsession drove him to launch a catastrophic campaign against the Parthian Empire in 53 BCE. He led 7 legions into the deserts of Mesopotamia, ignoring warnings from allies and advisors, convinced that conquest in the East would finally earn him the respect his wealth had failed to secure. The campaign ended in disaster at Carrhae, where Parthian cavalry destroyed his army and killed his son before his eyes. Crassus himself was captured and executed. Accounts claim molten gold was poured down his throat, a symbolic surfeit of the precious metal he had spent his life accumulating. Whether this detail represents historical fact or poetic invention remains debated, but its persistence suggests how Romans themselves understood his legacy, a man consumed by the very appetites that had driven his rise. Rome would continue burning for decades after his death, with major conflagrations erupting regularly until Emperor Augustus finally established the vigils, a public fire brigade funded by the state and obligated to respond to any blaze regardless of property ownership. This innovation came too late for the countless Romans who had watched Crassus's negotiators approach while their homes burned. Too late for those who had made terrible calculations about immediate loss versus total ruin. But it established a principle that Crassus's private enterprise had implicitly rejected: that some services are too essential to be left to market forces, that emergency creates vulnerability that law must address, that a society reveals its values not in how it treats citizens during prosperity, but in what protections it extends during catastrophe. The story of Crassus and his fire brigade endures not because it was uniquely evil, but because it was perfectly legal, not because it violated Roman norms, but because it exemplified them. It demonstrates how systems that fail to establish collective responsibility for essential services create opportunities for those with resources to profit from those without options. His methods shocked no one in his own time precisely because they operated within accepted frameworks of Roman commerce and property law. What appears exploitative in hindsight seemed merely entrepreneurial to contemporaries, a man identifying unmet demand and providing service at rates determined by circumstances. He was neither hero nor villain, but something more instructive. An entrepreneur who recognized that crisis creates markets, and that the boundary between legitimate profit and unconscionable exploitation depends entirely on the legal and moral structures a society chooses to establish or neglect.